Nehemiah, Esther, and then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi in that order. Then we'll come back, time permitting, and introduce the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and probably Job as well. Don't know that we'll cover all of that tonight, obviously, but I believe what we'll do this evening is do a kind of a rapid overview of these books and then go back to our textbook and make some notes about each of the books that we'll be looking at. So we'll start with the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles this evening. I sent to Dave, and I think he has passed on to you, a series of articles. These are little 1- and 2-page articles, actually written as a bulletin article series and largely based in part on information in Brother Frank Dunn's excellent book, Know Your Bible, synopses of the books of Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and so forth. So that's where we'll begin tonight, with some of those outlines, just kind of covering the substance of the books, the contents, and then I want to come back and go over some of the background to the books. So let's begin with the text tonight. And if you look at Kings and Chronicles together, you might assume that they're parallel accounts because they do have a lot of the same information. They do chronicle the same time period, although from somewhat different points of view. Now, the Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as we know them, were one book in the ancient Hebrew Bible, just like Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The difference, the main difference, is that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are historic books. They are compiled from existing records. That does not take away from their inspiration in the least, but 1st and 2nd Chronicles do not appear to have been written during the occurrence of the events that they record. Rather, 1st and 2nd Chronicles appear to be a synopsis of sorts of Hebrew history, probably compiled and written for the benefit of the returnees from exile and those who are still in Persia and Media and scattered throughout the Gentile world. They appear to date from after or during and after the period of Babylonian captivity. Now, in Hebrew, these books are called, or this book really is called, the Words of the Days, basically a record of their history, a record of the events of the times. In the Hebrew, that is. Now, in the Greek, the title is Things Omitted, which is interesting. In the Septuagint translation, Things Omitted, and that gives rise to the idea then that this includes information, or these books present information that in some respects was not included in Samuel's records or in 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, there is a Jewish tradition, and that's all it is, a Jewish tradition that says that Ezra was the inspired writer of the Chronicles, and certainly given the time in which he lived and the resources that he had available. Nehemiah, co-worker, preacher, as it were, prophet with Ezra, living in the same time frame, governor under the Medo-Persians of the province or the territory of Judah. Nehemiah reputedly had an excellent and extensive library, and certainly Ezra would have had access to that in terms of the historical information. Like I said, though, that does not take away in the least from the idea that this is inspired literature any more than the books of Luke and Acts would be somehow less inspired, because Luke begins his record of the life of Christ by saying, I have carefully researched and compiled all of these things, but that doesn't take away from the inspiration of it at all. Now, the Chronicles are different than the record of the Kings. They focus more on the history of Judah, not the 12 tribes overall, more specifically on the southern kingdom. Now, in Chronicles, the genealogies go all the way back to Adam, and they trace David's lineage all the way down through the return from exile in Babylon. And it seems that the basic purpose is to give some assurance, some comfort to the exiles, those who had returned, particularly with Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, to give them some assurance that God is going to remain faithful to his purpose, that God is going to continue their restoration, that he's going to make good his promise to them. Now, as you look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this is information from 1st Chronicles right now. The first 3 chapters are simply the lineage of Judah's kings from Adam all the way down to David. From Adam through his children, down through Noah, down through Abram, all the way down to David. And then onward through the succeeding kings down to Zedekiah, and then on through exile to the period of the restoration. You take your Bible and turn to 1st Chronicles, come down to chapter 3. These are the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron. So now we're down to the time of David, but we come down to the end of the chapter and we get to the sons of Hananiah, Pelatiah, Yeshaiah, his son Rephaim, his son Arnan, his son Obadiah, Shechaniah, etc., etc., etc. You get down to the last verse, the sons of Elionai, Hodaviah, Eliashib, Peliah, Akub, Johanan, Deliah, and Anani, seven sons. So these are those who followed down through the time of restoration. Now, come down to chapter 4 and you find the prayer of Jabez. Now, you may be familiar with the book, The Prayer of Jabez by Bruce Wilkinson. And the whole proposition of his book is this is Jabez's prayer for prosperity. And if you pray this prayer, God will prosper you materially as well. And that's not what this is all about. It's his own interpretation of what you find here. What you find in chapter 4, the sons of Judah, down through here, you come to verse 10, Jabez called upon the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, "Oh, that you would bless me, enlarge my border, that your hand might be with me, keep me from harm so that it might not bring me pain." And God granted what he asked. Well, what that really is a testimony to the faithfulness of Jabez. That is not a prescription for material comfort and prosperity. Now, the balance of chapter 4 and on through chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 takes you through the descendants of the various other tribes. This is the section, and it's basically the only section in Chronicles that deals with the northern tribes, the descendants of Naphtali and Reuben and Gad and Issachar and Simeon and so forth. The rest of the Chronicles is focused primarily on Judah. Now, chapter 9 brings us to the families of the returnees, the exiles, those who had come back. All Israel was recorded in genealogies. These are written in the book of the kings of Israel. Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. Now, stop right there for a second. There is the single, simplest, most direct, explicit explanation in all of the Old Testament for Babylonian captivity. The most succinct statement in all the Old Testament. Judah went into captivity, Israel, but Judah specifically, in Babylon because of their breach of faith, because they did not keep faith with God. It's that simple, and it's that direct. Now, chapter 10 records the death of King Saul and his sons. And look down to chapter 10 and verse 10 for just a moment. At verse 8, after the death of Saul, the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They stripped him, took his head and his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. But, when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons and brought them to Jabesh, buried their bones under the oak, and fasted 7 days. Now, Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord. Saul died because of his sin. The rest of this book, First Chronicles, is going to detail the life of David. This is the most extensive record, really, of the activities, the life, the experiences of David. It gives us lists of his advisors. It gives us lists of the mighty men, his most valiant warriors. And there are some interesting characters among those men. Ittai of Gath, for example, who would seem to be a mighty Philistine in service to Israel under David. But in chapters 13, 14, 15, we have the record of David trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And this is the sad incident of Uzzah violating the ordinance. Of course, bear in mind that the whole experience there, the whole process in this context was illegitimate. The Ark of the Covenant had been brought out like some kind of lucky charm when the Israelites were fighting the Philistines under King Saul. It had been captured by the Philistines and placed in their temple, Dagon's temple, where the statue of Dagon repeatedly fell on its face in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Finally, the Philistines, who were having all manner of shall we say, ill fortune because of its presence there, put 2 and 2 together. We've got to get rid of this thing. So they loaded it on an ox cart and sent it back. Just let the oxen go, and it went back. It stays put at where it's located until David is ready to bring it ultimately to Jerusalem. But when he first sets out to do that, they go about moving it in much the same way it had come there, via an ox cart. It's loaded up, it's carried along on the ox cart, which was against the instructions given by Moses all the way back in the book of Exodus and in the book of Leviticus. It was supposed to be carried on foot with poles through the rings in it by the Levites. And with it rumbling along on the ox cart, of course, we know the record. The oxen stumbled. Uzzah reaches up his hand, perhaps purely an instinctive response on his part. But even so, God smote him right there. He died. And they turned aside, left it there until they had searched out and realized what they'd done wrong. We sought it not according to the due order of things. Now, you look at chapter 15 and verse 13. Here is the summary of that whole process. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the rule, according to the due order of things. Now, coming into chapter 16, when the Ark of the Covenant actually reaches Jerusalem, David appoints musicians who play various instruments. You have a couple of references to that in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, in connection with giving thanks in the presence of the ark and the sacrifices that are offered at Gibeon. Now, it's worth pointing out that sometimes folks will try to use this passage as an authorization for the use of mechanical instruments in Christian worship. Is it the case that the ancient Jews used instruments in their worship?
Yes.
It is. They did not begin that way. It seems, we can't document with certainty, but it appears that the use of instruments began basically during the reign of David. David was himself a talented singer, a talented musician, and certainly a talented songwriter, composer, and lyricist. We have at least 75 psalms which are poems set to music, basically, that he is credited with authoring by inspiration. Was it a violation or a prohibition of any instruction God had given that they did this? Not that we have any record of. Is there any indication that God was displeased by it in the Old Testament? Go ahead, Miss Sherry, you got a hand up.
Yeah, wasn't that why she was stricken with leprosy? Because she used dancing and music?
No, if memory serves me, she was stricken with leprosy when she and Aaron contested with Moses about
who has authority. Okay. I was thinking about something.
The older sister, and she and then Aaron and then Moses in birth order, apparently. And it seems she didn't take too kindly to the little brother being in charge.
Is there something in the book of Hosea about them, woe unto those who make unto themselves music as David did, or something like that?
There is a reference to that, but does that speak to this? Don't
brother.
Go ahead.
That reference is Amos chapter 6, verse 1-5. But oftentimes we take that passage out of its context.
Yes,
we need to be careful.
We do. So we have this statement of fact that they have instruments. We have no indication of condemnation from the Lord in that respect. Now we have folks trying to draw on that as an authorization for us to use instruments today. And we can turn to passages like Romans 15 and verse 4. These things were written for our admonition and our learning. And they'll say, see there, we're supposed to learn from this. This is all right. This is pleasing to God. But if we're going to be consistent in trying to draw this in and use this as an authorization for what we want to do in the 21st century, then we also need to go either to Jerusalem or to Gibeon. We also need to offer burnt offerings. We need to worship in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, by the way, where is it? If you've seen the Indiana Jones movies, you know it spent a number of years in a giant cave warehouse somewhere in Virginia and was then stolen by a Russian woman. So where is it now? Don't know. Here's the point. Oh, and by the way, if you were going to do this, you also need to be Jewish. Here's the point. If there is any lesson to draw out of this for 21st century worship, I would suggest that it goes to Acts chapter 17 and Paul's statement to the Athenians that the times of ignorance God winked at, God overlooked. There were things in the Old Testament era that God tolerated without an explicit stamp of approval. In the New Testament, we have explicit instructions. Sing and make melody in your heart, which is the biblical mind, unto the Lord. That gives us both the commandment and the instrument, the mind, the heart, that we're to play, so to speak. And there is no mention, no authorization for the use of instruments in New Testament worship by Christians. Now, go over to chapter 17. Here in chapter 17, David wants to build a temple. Now we have the Lord renewing his covenant or making a covenant with David, and David wants to build a temple for the Lord. I live in a fine palace, and the ark of the Lord, the thing that represents the presence of the Lord among us, is in a tent. How is this right? And we can certainly relate to and understand David's line of thinking in that. I live in a fine house. Why should the ark of the Lord be out here in a tent? Well, of course, the response to that through Nathan the prophet, after Nathan says, hey, it sounds good to me, God says, when did I ask you to do that? When did I instruct you to do that? And the lesson to draw out of this is that the silence of God on a subject is not permissive, but is restrictive. Martin Luther, the great Reformation theologian, operated, and much of Protestantism today operates on the principle that anything God has not explicitly forbidden, we're permitted to do. Ulrich Zwingli, a contemporary in Switzerland with Luther, operated on the opposite principle. Anything God has not expressly authorized, we are not permitted to do. Zwingli was much closer to David and Nathan than Luther was. Without an instruction from God, David did not have permission to build the temple. Now he did, the Lord did promise him, I'll let your son do it. You're a man with blood on his hands, but I'll let your son do this. And the point is, it sounded like a good idea to David, sounded like a good idea to Nathan. But just because it sounded like a good idea didn't make it right. Now, come on down through chapters 18, 19, 20. You have the record of some of David's battles and conflicts and conquests. And in chapter 22, now we have the preparation for the temple. David arranges for everything to be purchased and prepared and held in waiting. And then in chapter 21, need to back up one chapter. In chapter 21, he does something dumb. He takes a census of his military personnel. How many soldiers does he have? Now, why would David need a census? The fact of the matter is, he does not. What's the principle of Israel's presence in the promised land? They're there because God put them there. Remember, go back to the book of Joshua. And what was the message? I, the Lord your God, will fight for you. Now, they had roughly 600,000 military-aged men throughout the book of Joshua. We get down here to chapter 21 in First Chronicles. Now, there are about 1.1 million in Israel, plus about 470,000 in Judah. So you've got an enormous, you more than doubled that number in the days of the conquest. What does David need that for? The Lord has not authorized him to become Alexander the Great and conquer the world. That's not what this is all about. God was displeased. He sends a pestilence, and they have to work this out. David builds an altar, offers sacrifice, and we have the end of the pestilence once God is placated and David has repented. Now, First Chronicles ends with David organizing the Levites and the priests, arranging their courses for service and so forth. And then at the end of the book, we have Solomon becoming king. That takes us then to Second Chronicles. I need a bigger lectern. I've got too much stuff on this. That takes us to Second Chronicles, and this just picks up the history. And I realize we're skipping rapidly through the events here, from Solomon forward. Now, Second Chronicles begins basically with God speaking to Solomon, ask what you will of me. And this young man, now let's pause and think about Solomon for a moment. Who is Solomon? He is David's son. He's not David's only son by a long stretch. David has a passel of sons, and most of them turn out to be not worth killing, hardly. Solomon, though, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord, is David's son through Bathsheba. He is young compared to some of his half-brothers, but he is the one who is selected to be king, and God speaks to him after he is crowned and basically offers him a blank check. Ask what you want from me. Now, Solomon starts out well. In this respect, Solomon is a lot like King Saul. Remember, King Saul, the only king who was not of the tribe of Judah, the one selected basically by the people, give us a king so we can be like the ungodly heathens around us. Saul started out well, a modest man. He didn't stay that way. Solomon starts out well. He's a young man. He's very intimidated. Ask what you will. It would be intimidating for any of us were the Lord to speak directly to us and say, ask me anything, I'll give it to you. Solomon shows a great deal of innate wisdom right off the bat. I'm a child. I don't know how to do this, Lord. Give me wisdom and an understanding heart. And God does. Blesses him with more wisdom than any ordinary mortal ever had. Only Jesus would surpass him in that respect. And pours out abundant material blessing as well. Now, God commends him for that humility, for that choice. That's, in one sense, that's almost the high watermark right there. Now, he will go on. We'll see in the book of Ecclesiastes his search for the meaning of life. I searched for the meaning of life in power, in building, in prosperity, in wine, women, and song, so to speak. And we get to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, and what's the summary? This is the end of the matter, chapter 12, verse 13. All hath been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. King James Version supplies the word duty, and that really takes away, in my judgment, from the substance of what Solomon is saying. This is what it is to truly be what God created, to fear God and keep his commandments. This is the sum of man, because God will bring every work into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or evil. That's the high watermark of Solomon's wisdom. Now, between now, the beginning, and then, he's going to build the temple. He's going to renew the plans and the contracts with Hiram, the king of Tyre, which shows us that the influence and the relations between the city of Tyre and the king of Sidon, that whole coastal Phoenician area, were not always adversarial between Israel and those Phoenician peoples. David had been quite friendly with Hiram, and he had the men who were skilled in preparing the materials. Now, these things were prepared and shipped by sea to Haifa, or to Joppa, verse 16 in chapter 1. And then they were carried overland to be assembled without sound of hammer or saw on site. Now, the friendship here between David and Hiram and Solomon and Hiram is significant, because you get down to the post-exile period of Nehemiah, and what do you find? Now the Phoenicians are not friendly. Now the Phoenicians are enemies, foes. And this is the time frame in which 1st and 2nd Chronicles are being written. So by inspiration, there is a reminder to the returned exiles that once upon a time, these people had been their friends. And had they once been their friends, what's the implication? They could be again. But in the meantime, they have been a corrosive influence. Remember, Jezebel, Ahab's wife, is a Sidonian princess who introduces the worship of Baal and the Asherah into Israel. Her father was ruler of Sidon and Tyre. Now, Hiram's respect for God did not continue after he died. Pick up in chapter 2, you go down through chapter 5, and this is the details of the construction of the temple. And it is a magnificent structure. It's on Mount Moriah. There were extraordinary sacrifices that accompanied the dedication of the temple. You find the Ark of the Covenant being brought in chapter 5. Chapter 6 gives us, in many ways, the most beautifully humble prayer in all the Old Testament. It's the prayer of dedication, pledging that Solomon and the nation will be loyal and faithful and humble before the Lord, which we've heard that before, haven't we, with these people? Remember Mount Sinai, all that the Lord has said we will do. Hey, Aaron, make us a golden calf. All that the Lord has said we will do, again and again and again, and it doesn't last. Well, it's not going to last here either. But come down here to chapter 8, and now as we move forward, we find Solomon stepping out of bounds. In chapter 8, at verse 11, Solomon marries a foreign wife, an Egyptian princess. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house that he had built for her and said, my wife shall not live in the house of David, king of Israel, for the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. Solomon knew what he was doing with an Egyptian princess as a wife was not appropriate, but he did it anyway. Now, before everything is said and done, we know that Solomon will marry some 700 wives, have some 300 concubines, an enormous harem, and for what it's worth, the more prominent among all of those marriages were almost undoubtedly primarily political matches, political arrangements for some commercial benefit or trade benefit. But nevertheless, he learned from his father. Now, how many wives did David have? David had a handful. Solomon far exceeded him. And it was not a good thing. He put her in a separate palace, put the Egyptian woman in a separate palace because he recognizes she's an idolater. She's not a worshiper of the Lord. It's not appropriate for her to be in my father's palace. But he's going to have her there in Jerusalem nonetheless. Now you come to chapter 9, we're introduced to the Queen of Sheba. Cecil B. DeMille notwithstanding, the tradition is among the Ethiopians that there was a child born of this assignation between Sheba and Solomon. Is there any substance to that? We don't know. There is no concrete evidence there. The synopsis of it, though, is her assessment of his wealth and his wisdom, and her summation is the half has not been told. Solomon dies at the end of chapter 9. Now, Solomon was a tremendous trader. He was a military power. The nation, in terms of its territory, expanded during Solomon's reign far beyond the boundaries seen even in David's era, and his commercial interests and influence dominated the Middle East during his lifetime. But he dies, and Rehoboam takes his place. Now you see the folly of Rehoboam in chapters 10, 11, and 12. Rehoboam was an egotistical fool, frankly, and that causes Jeroboam, who had been at one point a loyal servant of Solomon, to take leadership and rebel with 10 of the 12 tribes and establish a separate kingdom. Now, the separate kingdom becomes known as Israel. The remnant becomes known as the kingdom of Judah. There is historical precedent for this in the days of David. David reigned 7.5 years at Hebron. Before becoming king over all Israel, he reigned in Judah. And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, had been the nominal king over the other tribes until his death. Now, the thing that stands out about Rehoboam is his foolishness. He manages to divide the kingdom when he could have united it. but his ego got in the way. It's during his era that the Egyptians come in and plunder Jerusalem. This is King Shishak of Egypt. He comes up and ransacks Jerusalem, basically, because Rehoboam, God permits it because Rehoboam is unfaithful. He grew strong in Jerusalem, but that was as far as it went. Now, look at chapter 15 and verse 2. We have we have Abijah and then Asa reigning. And in chapter 15, Asa stands out in Jerusalem because he is a righteous man. Chapter 15, verse 2, the Lord is with you while you are with him. Fellas, that'll preach.
That'll preach there.
The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you. Those seem to be the principle of Asa's rulership. For the most part, he is a righteous, upright king. He even got rid of his own mother from an influential position because of her idolatry down in verse 16. Ma'akah, his mother, King Asa removed from being queen mother because she had made a detestable image for the Asherah. He cut down her image, crushed it, and burned it at the brook Kidron, put it down in the dump, basically, and disposed of it. But then we come to Jehoshaphat in chapter 17, and Jehoshaphat shows us the folly of trying to play both ends against the middle. He makes an alliance with Ahab, winds up with one of Ahab's daughters as wife, if memory serves me, and he's trying to have it both ways. Now, Jesus speaks to this kind of situation in Matthew chapter 5 and chapter 6 and verse 24. No man can serve two masters. He'll either hate the one, love the other, hold to the one, or despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. This is what Jehoshaphat was trying to do: hold hands with God on the one hand and be righteous and faithful, and hold hands with Ahab on the other hand and facilitate him in the name of unity or union or what have you. So that does not work out well for him. He made an alliance with Ahab, and God sends a prophet to correct him, to scold him for what he had done. That takes us down through Jehoshaphat. Well, come to chapter 22. Here is perhaps in some ways the darkest moment in Judah's history up to the time of conquest. And this is where Athaliah, the only woman to ever rule over Judah, takes control. Chapters 22, 23, 24, Athaliah manages to seize the reins of power. Ahaziah, her son, dies. She's the queen mother. She sets out to consolidate power and rule, but she misses Jehoash. And guided by a priest, Jehoiada, Joash turns out to be a godly young man. Once Athaliah is thrown out of power, executed, disposed of, with Jehoiada's guidance, Joash begins to clean things up, straighten things out. They've gotten into idolatry. They're going to get rid of it. He purges the land of idolatry and Baal worship, tears down the temple that had been built to Baal, disposes, executes Matan, the priest of Baal, and restores the temple, cleans it up and makes sure that everything is corrected. Now, the great lesson here in his life is that after the death of Jehoiada, the priest, when his righteous influence is removed, what happens to Joash? Joash and his nobles begin to stray. They begin to fall off. Jehoash has Zechariah murdered. He's the successor and the son of Jehoiada, has him murdered for scolding him about idolatry. So the very thing that had set him apart in his early years becomes a snare to him in his age. And Joash winds up being murdered by his own servants. Now, come down to chapter 25. And in chapter 25, you have a reference back to Deuteronomy 24 and verse 16. Amaziah has become king. He's 25 years old. He reigns 29 years. And we get to verse 4. He did not put his children to death according to what is written in the law in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers shall not die because of their children, nor children die because of their fathers. Each one shall die for his own sin. Now, Amaziah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 3, as soon as he was firmly in power, he executes the servants who had murdered his father. But the standout statement there in verse 4, each one shall bear his own sin. That echoes Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 4 and 20. Be sure your sins will find you out. Numbers 23 or 32 and verse 23. One of the confusing things in Hebrew history is that the names repeat oftentimes, and there is a tendency on the part of some to conflate names, to identify different people that are not connected to each other with one another because of the similarity of names. Now, at this point in time, Amaziah is king in Judah. His father, as king of Judah, was Joash. But the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, during this time is also a man named Joash. And he goes to war with Amaziah and plunders the temple and the treasury. These are two different men. It's important for us to realize that the names sometimes repeat. In Israel, the northern kingdom, we have two different Jeroboams. You have Jeroboam, who established the northern kingdom and taught Israel to sin. And then generations later, you have another Jeroboam who was basically like his namesake. He was an unrighteous man as well. Now, come to chapter 25 and verse 2, the summary of Amaziah's reign, as well as his successors, Uzziah and Jotham, who are in chapters 26, 27. The summary of this is, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not with a whole heart. That could describe religious people in our generation, in our 21st century, to a T. How many folks do we encounter who want to be considered spiritual, but not particularly religious? How many Christians are content to be SMO Christians, Sunday mornings only, or CEO Christians, Christmas and Easter only? That's very common in the denominational community, and increasingly so even among our brethren. We want to be right with God, but on the minimum daily requirement plan. And the Lord does not deal in minimums. He wants wholehearted servants. Well, we get down to chapter 27 and Jotham, and then Ahaz at the end of chapter 27. Ahaz becomes more faithless to the Lord as things go downhill, and it doesn't end well for him. Chapter 29 brings us to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah is outstanding in his faithfulness and his righteousness. Chapters 29, 30, 31, 32, a long period devoted to the, I guess you could say, the adventures of Hezekiah. Now, for what it's worth, you get over to chapter 32, and here we have a record of Hezekiah's aqueduct, a conduit built into the city of Jerusalem. And that is to supply water in the event of siege. That aqueduct still exists, chapter 32, verse 30. You can go to Jerusalem, see it today, and in fact, you can walk through it if you're willing to duck down and mind your head. It was an extraordinary bit of engineering, and it stood Jerusalem in good stead in later sieges, right down through the time of the Babylonian conquest and the Roman conquest in 70 AD. Didn't prevent them, but it stood them in good stead. Now, questions or comments about Chronicles? If not, we'll move on with rapid haste, as they say. Okay, flip back to the book of Ezra. Now, Ezra, comparatively short book, 10 chapters, chronicles, or it records Judah's restoration. From the book of Chronicles to the book of Ezra, the end of Judah down to the beginning of Judah's revitalization under Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel, you have a period of the captivity. And during this time, there's not much written about that time. We don't have a lot of record of what goes on during the captivity period. The most extensive or detailed record of the captivity period events basically is the life of Daniel. And what we know about Daniel, Daniel goes into Babylonian captivity as a teenager in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, is trained as a bureaucrat, serves in the Babylonian Empire faithfully, prophesies, foretells, writes down messianic prophecy, serves until the Babylonians are overthrown. So he serves through 3 generations of Babylonian rulers, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and then Belshazzar. Belshazzar is overthrown. His father is defeated in the field. The Medo-Persians under Darius and ultimately Cyrus take control, and Daniel becomes a bureaucrat in the Medo-Persian Empire. So he's now quite aged, at least in his 80s, probably in his 90s. And the record of what has happened in history, as far as God's people are concerned, during that 70-year period, really about the 50 years from the fall of Jerusalem until the decree of Cyrus, 586 down to 536. Biblically, the gist of what happened is the life of Daniel. And when the Chronicles are recorded after the restoration, if you go back to the end of the book of Chronicles, notice where it ends. Chapter 36, at verse 17, Nebuchadnezzar the Lord brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar, killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. The Lord gave them all into his hands, all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. They burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword. They became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord came by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, etc. Chronicles doesn't tell us anything about the period of captivity. And think about this. If Chronicles, the record of things omitted, the record of days, was written for the returned exiles, why would they want to remember anything associated with their captivity. That is a dark day, a dark time in Hebrew history. It is a time of punishment for their sins. So they have no reason to write down any record of what went on during that time. In one sense, it's a period of history that they would just as soon forget. So we go from the destruction in 586 to the restoration in 536. And except for the record of Daniel's life and the events of Jeremiah's being hauled off against his will into Egypt early on, there is no other record of this time in the scriptures, because it's a period that they would not want to remember its details. So we come to Ezra, and Ezra picks up where Chronicles leaves off with the decree of Cyrus. Now, the prophecy given by Jeremiah had been about 100 years earlier, that God would restore Judah to the promised land only after the 70 Sabbath years, as it were, of exile. Cyrus had been named by name about 200 years before by the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, down through about chapter 45, verse 2. Named by name is the one who would restore the Jews. Now that's astonishing. Surely some of the leaders among the Jews, Ezra and others, must have pointed out to Cyrus in the writings of Isaiah that this is what our God prophesied that you would do. Now, for what it's worth, historically, the Medo-Persians, their ascendance marks a dramatic shift in the policy toward conquered peoples from the Syrians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians, where they had tended to displace people like they did with the Israelites and the Jews. The Medo-Persians gave them freedom to be restored to their lands, and not just the Jews and the Israelites, but many of the conquered peoples that they had inherited from the Babylonian Empire. Historically, they allowed a number of conquered peoples the freedom to return. And for what it's worth, just like the Jews and the Israelites, most of them did not. Think about this. At the time that Ezra begins his work, Judaism, the Jews, the 12 tribes even, have largely assimilated into Babylonian and Medo-Persian culture. They have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren born in Babylon, born in these different places. Their parents are buried there. They have houses, farms, fields, businesses established there for 2 and 3 generations. Imagine what it takes to pull up stakes and move from a stable, prosperous circumstance to a place where you have, from a human point of view, you have no assurance of any prosperity, no assurance of any level of comfort like you have become accustomed to. Think about selling out all your property and possessions today and moving then with your entire family to Southeast Asia or to Africa or to the Middle East and trying to reestablish yourself there. How much hardship might that entail? What would you expect that to involve? Those are lesser developed parts of the world. Remember, in Judah, these people were dealing with an area that has been desolated. There is no infrastructure waiting for them. There are no houses or cities, fields or vineyards waiting for them to just move in and take over. They have to start from scratch. So most of them opt to stay put. Now that has a dramatic impact on Judaism overall. It's going to change the common language of the Jewish people. It's not going to happen overnight, but their common language is going to shift from Hebrew to Aramaic to Greek. Those who return generally end up speaking Aramaic. But as Alexander conquers the world, the language of world commerce becomes Greek. It's going to change their customs. It's going to change their attitudes. They're not isolated from the world anymore. Now they're part of it, even if they do still cluster in Gentile society. Now, Cyrus here is confirmed archaeologically by the words of something called the Cyrus Cylinder, which is an archaeological find that records in stone what Cyrus did. It's a record of his works. Now you look at Ezra chapter 1, verses 2, 3, and 4. Here is the record of his proclamation. He acknowledges God as the source of his power. Now, this does not imply that Cyrus was a worshiper of the God of heaven only, any more than Nebuchadnezzar before him had been. What this does is it shows that he acknowledged the influence of the Hebrews' God, the Jews' God, in their thinking and in their prosperity or their potential prosperity. And so he challenges them, or he authorizes them to return, to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, and there to offer offerings in his name, on his behalf. The king's commandment, verse 3, also authorizes any of the northern kingdom's people, the 10 tribes who want to return. They're also allowed to return. So there's a tacit recognition that northern kingdom and southern kingdom are in fact one people. But he even goes so far as ordering those who choose to remain behind to financially support those who return. And notice that he returns the temple vessels that had been part of Nebuchadnezzar's plunder in verses 7 through 11. Now, this picks up where 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles end. Chapter 2 is a record, a census of those who returned, 49,897 people. Just shy of 50,000. How many Jews were there in the world at this point? We don't have an accurate census. You go back to the days of King David, remember how many soldiers he had in that census? 1.5 million soldiers. Take that, and if there's just one woman for every soldier and one child for every couple, you're at 4.5 million right there. That would have been an extraordinarily low birth rate. 2.1 children per couple is considered replacement rate. That takes into account attrition and disease and so forth. So if there were 2.1 children per couple, just the military aged men in David's day, we're talking roughly 6.5 million there. And historically, they were typically much, much more prolific than that. How many people did Nebuchadnezzar take into captivity over the 20-odd years of his conquest? Millions. Millions. How many go back? 50,000. Later on, we'll see a few thousand more. The sum total of the Jews who return over the period of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel probably less than 70,000. That is a small percentage. Most of the exiled Jews never returned to live in Judah. On the other hand, look at chapter 2, picking up down here at the end at verses 68 and 69, and look at how much treasure they contribute for the reconstruction of the temple. That tells you how comfortably, how prosperously they were living in the Medo-Persian Empire. They had followed the Lord's instructions in Jeremiah 20:29 to pray for the well-being of their country, to buy houses and to settle down and so forth. Now in chapter 3, we have the seventh month, the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one to Jerusalem. And here's where they rebuild the altar for burnt offerings so that the daily sacrifices can resume. They don't have the temple built, but they're going to begin resuming the daily sacrifices. The foundation to the temple is now laid in the rest of this chapter. And in chapter 4, now we encounter opposition. The people of the land, that is the neighboring peoples, most likely Gentiles, and very possibly Gentiles who had been transplanted into the land by Nebuchadnezzar at the time that he had exported the Jews. These people, idolaters, are going now to oppose Zerubbabel and the Jewish leadership because they did not make common cause. They did not invite them to participate. Why? They're not Jews. They're idolaters. Notice in chapter 4, the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel. They approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses. Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. And Zerubbabel would have none of it. We alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Now, these people want to be part of what's going on. They say we have been worshiping properly all along. If these are the people of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the latter-day Samaritans, they are not worshiping as the Jews worship. If they are worshiping God at all, they're worshiping as the patriarchs worshiped. But Zerubbabel's response basically says, God has not authorized you to participate in this. And they did not take it well. So they lobby Cyrus, they lobby the king to stop things, and they stop. This is going to stay stopped for roughly 16 years. In the meantime, what do the people do? They build their own houses. Artaxerxes becomes king. This is throughout the reign of Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes. This is the king who was married to Esther, by the way, in Esther chapter 2. Come down to chapter 5. Now Darius becomes king, and the prophets Haggai and Zechariah are in Jerusalem to help out, to spur things along. Now, let me back up one page just a minute. In chapter 6, we have chapter 5, the rebuilding begins. Chapter 6, Darius makes his decree that the royal treasury will pay all the expense of it. And notice verses 13 through 15. According to the word sent by Darius the king, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-bozenai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. The elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, finished their building by the decree of the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. All right, the building is finished. Now at verses 17 and 18, we have the record of what they offered. They offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, 12 male goats. Go back to 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon's temple was dedicated, and this is a pathetic comparison. The building they built was a poor man's copy. The offerings they offered, while acceptable to the Lord, were a shadow of what Solomon had been able to offer. Now, it's not until we get to chapter 7 that we actually meet Ezra. Ezra is introduced here. The rest of the book, 7, 8, 9, 10, details his work among the exiles, the returnees. And at chapter 7, he was skilled in the law of Moses, verse 6. The king granted him all that he asked. The hand of the Lord his God was on him. Chapter 7 and verse 10 gives us a 3-part formula for success. Set your heart to seek the law of the Lord, do it, and teach others. Well, that sort of echoes what Paul would say, or presages really what Paul would say to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2. The things that you have heard of me in the sight of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Notice in verses 21 down to 26 in chapter 7, you have express instructions by the king, the Medo-Persian king, that the people are to enforce the law of God. Verse 26, whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him, for whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of his goods or for imprisonment. Follow the law. Now in chapter 8, we have Ezra setting everything in order, sends for the Levites and puts them to work, fasting and prayers for protection. And in chapters 9 and 10 now, we have a problem that arises, and that is intermarriage. They have folks among the Israelites, among the Jews, who have intermarried with Gentile people, who have intermarried with Moabites and Egyptians and Amorites and so forth, and it's not good. And so chapters 9 and 10 deal with correcting that problem. And you come to the end of chapter 10, and you have a listing here of those who were guilty of intermarriage. They commit themselves to put away their foreign wives. They didn't just abandon them, they did what the law of Moses required in that respect. Well, that brings us then to Nehemiah. Ezra, Zerubbabel, Haggai, Zechariah, Nehemiah are all basically contemporaries. They all work in the same time frame after captivity has ended. And in 445, Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah, who is one of his trusted officials, to straighten things out. Nehemiah has received a bad report from Jerusalem. This is during that period when things are basically come to a halt. One of his brethren, Hanani, now very possible that it's actually his brother in the flesh, probably though just a fellow Jew, a generic reference to a fellow Jew. They have come from Judah. They've brought a bad report of how things have gone. Work has come to a halt. We've had opposition, we've had problems, and so forth. And so Nehemiah is upset. He doesn't just mourn and lament. He looks for the reason. Why have we not prospered? Why have our people not prospered? He's not in Judah at this point. He's still in Shushan, in the palace, in that area. Here's the root of the problem. We've been half-hearted about this. We haven't done what we ought to. And so the rest of chapter 1 is the record of his prayer of confession on behalf of himself and the people. And it ends with the statement, now I was cupbearer to the king. I was politically connected, in other words. Chapter 2 explains how he winds up coming back to Jerusalem. He's sent by the king. He goes with the king's authority. He asks permission to go, verses 4, 5, and 6, and makes the request. Now, a point that we ought to draw out of this, and fellas, this will preach, is that oftentimes when we lack blessings we need, it's because we don't ask. There is a principle here with respect to God. We have not because we ask not. Remember the warning, though, in James chapter 4, you ask amiss that you may spend it in your pleasure. Don't ask amiss. But on a practical level, in the day-to-day affairs and activities of the church, oftentimes congregations go begging because leadership, elders, are hesitant or unwilling to put awareness of a need before the congregation and challenge to fulfill the need. There's a lesson to be learned here. Now, Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah to straighten this out, basically. Nehemiah has a vision. He has an image for what he wants to accomplish. You look at chapter 2 and verse 5, here's what I want to do. I want to, verses 5 and following, I want to rebuild. I want to get this off the ground. And he goes there. The first thing he does, he doesn't make a big splash. He goes and surveys the situation first. Once he knows what he's dealing with, the record of rebuilding begins in chapter 3. And this is where the neighbors again try to participate. The leadership in Jerusalem are kind of passively resisting, passive aggressive. They're just not being very helpful. And chapter 4, we have Sanballat and Tobiah attempting to stop things altogether once again. Now, Nehemiah is not going to have any of this. And so even with the threat of intimidation, he takes the workforce, divides it in half. Y'all stand guard, y'all work. Trade places, y'all stand guard, y'all work. And they built the wall around the city. The people had a mind to work. In chapter 5, now we get down to the root of the problem in Judah. See, they've been there for a number of years now, and they have not prospered. Well, the reason they haven't prospered is that some of their people haven't learned anything from their 70 years in captivity. They're oppressing their own people, taking advantage of each other, oppressing the poor, buying up or simply assuming inheritances and properties because they can. And Nehemiah puts an end to that. Now, he's appointed governor at this point. Verse 14, chapter 5, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people, took from them for their daily rations 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. A new broom sweeps clean, in a manner of speaking. They did not take advantage like their predecessors had done. Now, chapter 6, we have the conspiracy against Nehemiah, Sanballat, and Tobiah and Geshem. They're going to try to get rid of him, try to stall things. and he simply refuses to participate. The wall is finished. The city is basically completed in chapter 7, the end of chapter 6. In chapter 7 now we have a listing of the exiles who have returned. The whole assembly together at verse 66 is 42,000 in this moment, in this circumstance, and a record of all that was given. He has gathered the people together in chapter 8 to get them off high center. They gathered, the book of the law is brought, their covenant is renewed with the Lord. Things are set in order, basically. And in chapter 9, then, we have a public confession of national sin, a very explicit confession. By the way, just a sort of a freebie. I realize this is an aside comment and we need to take our break here in just a moment, but just a little observation. Genuine confession is not made with a statement that says, well, if I have somehow hurt someone or offended someone in some way, oh, I'm sorry that you were hurt and offended. That's not a confession. You want to see a confession, look at Nehemiah 9. Chapter 10, you have the record of the covenant, the people who agreed to it, the obligations of it. Notice chapter 10, verse 28, the rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, temple servants, all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, and their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, their nobles, to enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God and his rules and his statutes. And it goes on from there. Chapters 11 and 12 give us the record of the leaders and the dedication of the wall, the priests and the Levites and so forth. And at chapter 13, we have the final reforms that Nehemiah makes. And it's necessary. They still, even at this point, they still have a problem with the influence of ungodly foreign people. Even the priests are not immune to that, which you go back to the end of the book of Judges, to that Levite with his concubine and so forth. And you see that this has been a continual problem for Israel. And so in chapter 13, they have to get all of these things straightened out, including still the persistent problem of foreign marriages, religiously mixed marriages, not racial, it's religious, spiritually mixed marriages. Okay, that leaves us with Esther and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi to take a quick look at after the break. But it's time for us to take our break. Comments, questions, observations before we do. Okay, let's take about 14 minutes and we'll be back at 7:32. Basic purpose. Now there's one curious aspect to Esther. God is not mentioned by name in the book of Esther. And that leads some commentators and some scholars to question the legitimacy of the book of Esther. But the book of Esther, in every word, in every line, exudes the providence of God in preserving the lineage of the Messiah. Now, the events in the book of Esther take place during the 5th century BC, in the 400s. So this is after the restoration has begun. This is in the period immediately after Jerusalem has finally been reconstructed, rebuilt. The temple has been rebuilt and dedicated. The city wall has been built. We're coming down to the time of the intertestamental period, but that's about 75 to 100 years away at this point. Esther shows us God preserving the lineage of the Messiah. Even though he is never mentioned per se, he is present in everything here. Two key words, providence and protection, two key thoughts really in this book of Esther. And this is the only biblical description of the Jews who remained behind in Babylon and in Persia after the permission to go home in 586 or 536 rather. Now this is a record of how a young Jewish woman winds up becoming queen. Keep in mind, Esther was not the only wife of the king. He had a wife before her. He had a harem in addition to her. But Ahasuerus is the ruler in this point of much of the inhabited world. He is generally identified, though there is some dispute about this, he's generally identified with the king named Artaxerxes in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That may or may not be entirely accurate. There is considerable debate and some confusion because several of the kings during this time period had names that were known by more than one name for one thing, but they also had names that were remarkably similar. And so this king is undoubtedly rules during the time period of Zechariah and Haggai, Ezra, Nehemiah, all of these guys. He rules much of the inhabited world. He's part of the Medo-Persian lineage of rulers. Now, something to keep in mind is that during this period, the Medo-Persian dominance is beginning to fade. It has not faded yet, and they are still the dominant power in the world, but they're not as powerful as they were just a few years before. The record of the book of Esther introduces us first to the king and to his prior wife, whom we know as Vashti. He provides an extravagant celebration of some sort, commands her to come and display herself before his nobles. She refuses. We credit her with modesty, whether that was the reason or not. Regardless, that's how we tend to look at it, and is then deposed as queen. Now, her position as queen would be as his favorite. We'll look in the text here in a minute and talk about Amestris and others, and the fact that Vashti is not named by that name in secular history. The Targum, which is an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, suggests, the wording is suggestive that her order was to appear unclothed before the assembled nobles. But it's much more likely, given the culture of the time and the setting, that she simply refused to unveil out of a sense of modesty. And for that, then, she was deposed. The king makes a rash decision. She had defied him, and his wise men now seize the opportunity to take her out of the way. This would seem to imply that they did not like her for some reason. Once he sobers up, he misses her, but he can't go back. The decrees of the Persian kings could not be undone. They could be worked around, as we'll see, but they could not simply be undone. And so the counselors, well, pick a new one, pick a new one. And he sends his people out, they send his people out, basically to abduct all the pretty girls around, put them in the harem, purify them for a period of months, basically to ensure that they were not expecting or anything of that sort. And Esther winds up being swept up in this procurement scheme, really is what it amounts to. She is introduced in chapter 2, verse 7 as the cousin of Mordecai. He is rearing her as his own child. He is older. Her parents are dead, so she is an orphan being reared by a cousin. She's taken into the harem, into the purification process, which takes a year. It ensures that they don't have any illegitimate heirs to the throne, and she keeps her Jewish background hidden. Chapter 2, verse 10, don't tell. Mordecai told her not to. Well, at this point then, Mordecai unveils a plot, reveals a plot against the king. Esther finds favor in the king's sight. Mordecai discovers a plot against the king, and the king is preserved. The rest of the story of Esther revolves around Haman, an Amalekite. Now, Haman is associated with Agag. This is not Agag, the king of the Amalekites, way back there. Agag in this period is a location rather than a person. So he is evidently from Agag. Haman has an ego that won't get through a double door. He is a prominent man. He's one of the king's counselors. Everybody's kissing up to him, sucking up to him, except Mordecai. And that just goes all over him. His people were ancient enemies of the Israelites, and Mordecai will not bow down to him. You know the rest of the story. Because of his hatred for Mordecai, Haman decides, I'll get rid of him and I'll get rid of all of these Jews in the process. Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. And he plots to maneuver the king onto his side, which he does, spinning out a series of basically lies about the Jewish people. He secures a law, even pays for the administration of it himself. And now in chapter 4, Mordecai sets Esther to deliver the people. Who knows but that you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this, verse 14. God's providence in action is here. He has set things in motion to preserve his people. Of course, you know the rest of the story, the party that she throws, the private dinner, as it were, an exclusive get together, and Haman's plot is revealed. The king, in the meantime, honors Mordecai, which just spoils Haman's good mood altogether. And when his plot is revealed, then he's hanged on his own gallows. In the meantime, the law that he had secured could not be undone. It decreed the murder of all Jews in all the provinces. What could be done is an additional law authorizing them to defend themselves and dispose of their enemies. The outcome of this, chapters 8 and 9, is the salvation of the Jews, the preservation of the people, the establishment of the feast of Purim, which means pieces or lot, and ultimately the elevation of Mordecai in the kingdom. Now, comments or thoughts before we move on to Haggai? You notice we jump back and forth through the Old Testament because we're trying to take these books more or less chronologically. Now, we'll come back to the wisdom literature in the next class, which would entail Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. I don't think we'll get to that tonight. Haggai is a short little prophetic book, just a few chapters. And this is one of the shortest books in the Bible. His name means festive or party in a manner of speaking. He is instrumental. He is involved in motivating the returnees to finish the job. They'd laid the foundation of the temple. They'd been stopped. 16 years have passed. Well, what have they been doing for 16 years? They don't seem to have appealed the decree. They don't seem to have taken any steps to try to get things, get permission to restart. In the meantime, they've been building their own houses. They've been taking care of themselves. And they have not prospered. So you look down here, and the challenge is consider your ways. Think about what's caused this. The imagery is vivid in the book of Haggai. You're putting your wealth into a bag of holes. What you're doing is pointless. You're marking time, expending energy and not getting anywhere. Their physical condition, verses 7 through 11 in chapter 1, they're wasting away in a manner of speaking. Consider your ways. You haven't kept God in the center of your lives, so you have not prospered. There is a valuable lesson for a 21st century generation that wants to be spiritual but not religious. If God is not the centerpiece of your life, and in that his people, his church, you will not prosper. God will not prosper you. You started well, you laid the foundation, then you got stopped, and you've been stuck on high center ever since. So the third point then comes in chapter 1 in verses 14 and 15, and that is that once the people are stirred up, God is pure, God does not look upon sin. Now the people are stirred up, they're able to finish the job. Now, this is basically a chronicle of the completion of the temple, in a manner of speaking. Chapter 3 is the prayer of Habakkuk, acknowledging the greatness of the Lord and the shortcomings of the people. And I realize I'm looking at the book of Habakkuk instead of Haggai. My apologies, folks. I kept wondering why that didn't, in the back of my mind, why that didn't track. I was looking at the wrong book. So that's why it didn't track properly. Anyhow, in chapter 2, we have the restoration temple being completed, and verse 9 in chapter 2 alludes to the coming messianic kingdom. And the point is, the glory of the coming kingdom will surpass even the glory of Solomon's temple, for the simple reason that it is in this temple, the church, that the Son of God would be able to proclaim genuine peace for all people, for all humanity. That brings us now to Zechariah. Zechariah is co-worker with Haggai, and the focus of his preaching is twofold: repent, remember your covenant. These guys are trying to get them off high center, get the temple built. Now, the temple, we've already talked about that a little bit tonight. The temple that they built is a poor man's copy. It's not the temple that we see at the end of Ezekiel. It's not anything close to Solomon's temple, except in general dimensions. It is a poor man's copy. They don't have the Ark of the Covenant. They put a limestone block as a placeholder in the Holy of Holies. But Zechariah gives us a number of visions. The vision of the horseman in chapter 1, patrolling the earth. Over in Revelation chapter 6, the colors of the various horsemen there are significant. Bloodshed, death, so on and so forth. Here, there's no particular significance associated with the colors, other than perhaps in the minds of the Jews. But the point is, they represent the fact that God is aware of what's going on in the world. God is angry with the nations. They're at ease. They furthered the disaster. Judgment will come upon them. Come to chapter 2, you have a second vision. And the point that Zechariah is making to these returned exiles is, look, people, look, you are the apple of God's eye. You are God's chosen people. Start acting like it. Not in the sense of being arrogant, but that is, recognize that God is on your side. God will dwell with your people. So rejoice. Don't focus on your troubles. Focus on your God, and that'll take care of these troubles. Going on down through chapters 3, 4, and 5, you have a series of visions, all calculated to re-emphasize that God is with them. God is on their side. Come into chapter 6 now, and in chapter 6, Zechariah tells of a ruling priest to come. He calls him the branch in verses 12, 13, and 14. Notice it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch, for he shall branch out from his place. He shall build the temple of the Lord. It is he who shall build the temple of the Lord and shall bear royal honor and sit and rule on his throne. There shall be a priest on his throne. The counsel of peace shall be between them both. The crown shall be in the temple of the Lord as a reminder to Halem, Tobiah, Jediah, and Hen, the son of Zephaniah." So, a ruling priest. Now, in national Judah, that was not possible. Go over to the book of Hebrews, and there the Hebrews writer talks about Christ as our high priest and makes the point, if he were on earth, he could not be a priest at all because he is of the tribe of Judah, concerning which tribe Moses said nothing about priests. It was not possible in political national Judah to have a ruling priest. Zechariah is not talking about political national Judah. He's anticipating spiritual Israel, the Israel of God, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 16, the church. Now, consider also, as Zechariah is giving these prophecies, these statements, seeing these visions, Zerubbabel's temple, the second temple, is in the process of being completed. So Zechariah could not be talking about any priest in that time, in his own time period. Now you pick up in chapter 7, 8, 9, down to the end of the book, really, a series of messianic prophecies. Now, one thing that stands out about Zechariah is that word for word, or pound for pound, you might say, there is more messianic prophecy per percentage of the writing than in any other Old Testament book, more than Isaiah as a percentage of the book. And they talk in chapter 9, a description of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 21, the betrayal of the Lord by Judas in chapter 11. Look at chapter 13. And in chapter 13, verse 1, "On that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness." Well, what day is he talking about? That's anticipating the coming of the kingdom, the opening of the kingdom in chapter 2 of the book of Acts. Finally, in chapter 14 of Zechariah, you have the dispersion of the Jews, the coming day of the Lord, and this is a day of judgment, the dispersion of the Jews from Jerusalem, ultimately AD 70, anticipating the events that would take place there. In the meantime, you look at verse 8, "On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half to the east, half to the west, shall continue in summer as in winter." That's the anticipation of basically the Great Commission. Luke chapter 24, verse 47, repentance and remission of sins to be preached in all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. That brings us then to Malachi, the last Old Testament prophet until John. John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, is truly the last of the Old Testament prophets, but he did no miracles, performed no signs, and he did not write anything. We have the record of him in the New Testament. This is the last prophet who writes down the message God gives to him until the coming of the New Testament prophets. It appears that he was a contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah. He, according to some, he dates not even as late as Haggai and Zechariah, early or late 6th century, in the 500s, 5 teens. But regardless, during his time, Judah and the returned exiles, they're spiritually careless. They're cool toward God. They're focused on themselves. They're a lot like people today who are very focused on the material concerns of the moment, and spiritual things. That's a hassle. It's a burden. Interesting little sidebar in that respect. How many of the big box fellowship denominational type groups now offer Saturday evening worship because it's such a hassle to get up on Sunday morning? And yet it misses the point that the first day of the week is the day that the Lord has authorized for his people. Malachi, in 4 chapters, takes God's people to task for their unspiritual attitudes and perspectives. Chapters 1, 2, and 3, a series of challenges and responses between God and his people. God is the prosecutor, basically, and the people are in the dock having the indictment read to them. And they have failed miserably to acknowledge him as they ought to. They're going through the motions, but their heart is not in it. Now we come to chapter 4, and chapter 4 is short and blunt. Judgment's coming if you don't straighten out. Now, the Jews of Malachi's day, as we look at the image of chapter 4, verse 2, the Son of Righteousness with healing in its wings, that they would understand as an appeal, go back to Moses' law, just as they would understand judgment only on a national scale in verse 4. But these are also anticipatory of what's yet to come. Look at chapter 4 and verse 5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Now, the great and awesome day there would look forward probably to 70 AD and the end of Israel, the end of Judah as a nation and as God's chosen people. But there certainly is an application even beyond that to final judgment, the day of the Lord in that respect. 7 times Malachi declares the love, the righteousness, the goodness of God, and 7 times God's people argue. They argue, if God is so good, why this, why that? And each time he shows, because you've been unfaithful, because you've been lackadaisical, because you've been cold-hearted. Each time they deny their sins. That's the way our world handles sin today. We just decree that sins aren't sinful anymore. But that doesn't change God. Well, we will leave the wisdom literature until next week because we don't have time to cover that as well. I want to go back. So take your textbook now and go back to page 383. I want to take note of a few background details. We'll just run rapidly through these same books in the same order and look at some details of the background of these books. Now, as we said, the books of Chronicles, or the book of Chronicles, that is the accounts of the days, the words of the days, does not name an author. It does not name an inspired penman. Tradition says that it was Ezra, and that makes good sense. He was a Levite. He would have had access to records. He certainly would have had access to Nehemiah's resources as the governor. Maccabees, an apocryphal book, Second Maccabees, cites a tradition that Nehemiah had an extensive library. And if that is true, there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't be. If that is true, certainly Ezra would have had access to that. Now, naturally, skeptical scholars can't agree about this. The one thing that they would argue that probably is correct is that this dates from after captivity. Well, that's probably correct. This is a historical record inspired by the Holy Spirit, not a contemporary record. The things recorded in the Chronicles are not recorded as they happen. They're recorded in the rearview mirror, looking back. A lot of the information here parallels Samuel and Kings. But by the same token, there's a lot of information here that's not found either in 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings. And the inspired writer here names some of his extra biblical or extra canonical sources. Well, that stands to reason. He's got historical records readily at hand. There are details here that are not found elsewhere in the scriptures. You've got the record of Rehoboam with Shishak's Egyptian invasion. You got Asa dealing with an Ethiopian. There is additional information here about some of the prophets, about Samuel and Gad and Nathan and Ahijah and a whole list of others. Others who are not named anywhere else in the scriptures. Asaph, probably, possibly the same Asaph to whom some of the Psalms are credited. Heman, Jeduthun, Iddo, Oded, various others. You have very little information given in the Chronicles about the dark side of David's and Solomon's reigns. Now that covers 80 years of Hebrew history right there. And we have in Samuel and Kings, the records of David's sins with Bathsheba and the misbehavior of his children and his wrath toward Nabal that was turned aside by Abigail and things like that. These are not found in Chronicles because written during the latter time after captivity has concluded, basically there's no reason to include them. It doesn't contribute materially to the purpose of the Chronicles, which is basically to fill in the gaps of things that are not included in Samuel and Kings. One of the things that critics try to do is take issue with the numbers that are presented throughout the books of the Chronicles. But generally speaking, any discrepancies in number are easily explained. Most of the discrepancies relate to the way things were notated in ancient writing rather than an inaccuracy on the part of the writer. Okay, now let's talk about Ezra and Nehemiah. And these two books go together. Ezra appears to be an Aramaic, as you look at the little sidebar here, an Aramaic form of the Hebrew name Ezer, which means help, and Nehemiah, the comfort of the Lord. In the Hebrew Old Testament, this is a composite book. These two go together. And the whole point is to chronicle or to record the reconstruction of the temple, the reconstruction of Jerusalem, the reconstruction basically of Hebrew worship, the Hebrew religion. Now, bear in mind that during the years of captivity, the years of exile, Ezekiel, for instance, working among the exiles, particularly with their leaders in captivity, Ezekiel has been fighting a constant battle, a constant argument with them about the goodness of God, about the faithfulness of God. Now that they're seeing the prophecies of restoration being fulfilled, this is the chronicle of how God goes about that and the things associated with it. This is, as I said, a composite book, a single book in the Hebrew Old Testament. It's not until the Septuagint comes along that we begin to see these books begin to be separated, segregated as first and second Esdras, which is just another way of saying Ezra. Now the time frame is mid-5th century, the 400s BC, about 460 down to about 450 or 445 during this time frame. And this is when Ezra and Nehemiah are present. One of the chief problems that they have to confront is the problem of religiously mixed marriages. And it's an ongoing problem because Ezra deals with it about 457, and Nehemiah then has to deal with it again 20 some odd years later. So it's an ongoing issue, an ongoing problem. They're trying to get the temple rebuilt. They're trying to get a Jewish economy reestablished and a Jewish nation in operation, basically. And between the intermarriage with idolatrous peoples and the cool-heartedness, if not cold-heartedness, of many of the returnees, and the lack of zeal on the part of the Judean leadership, it's an ongoing challenge for these men. This time frame of roughly 460 down to about 435 BC, give or take a few years either way, corresponds to both the historical biblical record, the things that we can gain there, and it corresponds to what we know in the secular information that is available to us. Now, let's talk about Esther. Esther is not a Hebrew name. Her name in Hebrew traditionally is Hadassah. Joe Lieberman, the former senator from one of those northeastern states, is married to, by all accounts, a very nice lady whose name is Hadassah. And that means myrtle, like a myrtle bush or crepe myrtle, that sort of thing. Esther is a Persian name, a Persian word that derives its meaning from the Persian word for star. And that would be a complementary name in that context. As we said a while ago, the book of Esther is focused on the providence of God, God protecting his people. And this is the only biblical window into Jewish culture outside of Judah during the period from the restoration in 536 to the coming of the Christ. But it shows us actually a good bit about the lives of the Hebrews in the Gentile world. Previously, they had been a very cloistered, isolated people. That's not the case anymore. The last 600 years of Hebrew national history is markedly different in terms of isolation versus exposure to the Gentile world compared to the first 600, 700 years of their national history. Throughout the time of the kings, they were by and large a fairly cloistered nation. Now, certainly Solomon had extensive trade influence all over the known world at the time, but the average Hebrew, the average Jew, didn't have any personal knowledge of the outside world, basically. From the time of captivity down to the destruction in 70 AD, the average Jew from that point on was well acquainted with the outside world because most of them lived in and interacted with the Gentile world on a daily basis. Tradition among the Jews is that Mordecai is the inspired writer of the book of Esther. It's possible that there could have been other men, might have been Ezra or Nehemiah. There is no solid evidence either way. Esther is one of the books of the Old Testament that is consistently challenged, consistently criticized by the skeptics in the biblical scholarship community. For one thing, they look at the record of Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is a secular historian. You can still get his work, a big, thick book like that, that chronicles this time period from a secular point of view. And the critics look at Herodotus and the information that he provides and look at the Bible and say, well, Herodotus doesn't mention a lot of these people. Herodotus doesn't mention Esther. He doesn't mention Vashti. He gives details about a queen of Xerxes or Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus, if these are all the same individual. He gives details about a queen of Xerxes whose name is Amestris, who is a Persian girl, not a Jew. And she is a brutal woman who carries out and facilitates murder and human sacrifice and things of that sort. And so the skeptic says, well, this is the queen during Xerxes' reign, not Esther, not Vashti, but Amestris. Well, Amestris is not queen the whole time. In fact, she is removed, she is deposed about the same time historically that Esther would have come on the scene. Now, is it possible that she could be identified with Vashti? There is no evidence at all to connect those two. Herodotus, as a historian, leaves a lot to be desired. Now, what he gives information on is very helpful, but he does not give a detail by detail, person by person history. He gives broad brushstrokes, and there are lots of important figures, lots of important events he doesn't even mention, he doesn't touch on. Therefore, for a critic to say, well, this couldn't be right in the Bible because Herodotus doesn't record it, that doesn't prove anything. That just gives you two independent accounts of some of the same events and people. There are a number of other objections to the book of Esther, objections about the time frame, which generally is based on a misunderstanding of who's in charge and who Mordecai is and when it took place. An objection about the number of provinces. The Bible says there were 127 provinces in the Persian Empire. But historically, there are, depending on what period of history you're talking about, 20 or 21 or 23 or 29 satrapies in the Persian Empire. Well, the mistake or the problem is the critic says, see, that can't, the Bible can't be right because it says there are 127 satrapies. No, it doesn't. It says 127 provinces and that there were satraps or rulers over them. It doesn't say there were 127 satraps over 127 satrapies. The distinction is that a province and a satrapy are not necessarily the same thing. Herodotus points out that there were about 60 different nations under Persian rule. Well, that's a whole lot more than 20 or 21 or 23 or 29 satrapies. What that means is there were lots of people, lots of different cultures incorporated into some of these larger political divisions. Think of it in a sense as being like the difference between states and counties. You may have several counties in a single state. You may have several provinces in a single satrapy. Other objections that are raised, oh, they couldn't possibly have killed 75,000 people. The Jews couldn't have killed 75,000 enemies in a single day. Why not? How many Jews were there? Our critics tend to look at the numbers that returned to the promised land, and they say, oh, they couldn't possibly have been that many. There were 50,000. No, it's probably more like several hundred or several thousand. But then they turn around and use that 50,000 ballpark figure as if that's all the Jews in the world. And we know for a fact that was not. That's just how many went back to the promised land when Cyrus let them go. 75,000 people in one day, that's not a stretch. Besides all of which, historically, the Persians were not impressed with human carnage. They didn't have any problem with brutality and slaughter and execution. Interesting thing in the text about Mordecai down here on page 397, the name Mordecai seems to be a derivative of Marduk, one of the false gods of the Persians. And then if you'll notice at the end of the section on Esther, the last little section here is about Haman the Agagite, and the point is made that Agag was a region, not a reference to the Amalekite king hundreds of years before in the days of King Saul. For what it's worth, it also points out that there is some secular historical evidence that confirms the accuracy of some of what we read in the book of Esther. The thing that stands out, or should stand out, in Esther is the institution of the Feast of Purim, as far as historical accuracy and so forth. The Feast of Purim, or Purim, has continued from the time of Esther through the time of Christ, and is still observed to some degree, even in modern Judaism. What would be the origin of this if the Bible is not correct? There's no reason for it even to exist, and yet historically it does. And Esther gives the explanation of it. Now, there is a little sidebar about post-exilic feasts on 397. And I want you to go into the text and just take a pen and add something to this. Purim is mentioned there, and then the Feast of Dedication, which does not figure in the book of Esther at all. But this, which is not mentioned in the Old Testament scriptures at all, it's mentioned in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, apocryphal books. This is mentioned in the New Testament, in John chapter 10, verse 22. So in that list of references over there on the right, you might want to just add John 10, verse 22. The Feast of Dedication is mentioned during the ministry of Jesus. And what is the Feast of Dedication? The Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Lights, celebrates the rededication of Zerubbabel's temple after it was defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, in 175 BC. We know it in the modern era as Hanukkah, the Feast of Days, or the Feast of Lights, or as little children might understand it, oh, that's Jewish Christmas, they get 8 days. Well, that goes back to the Feast of Dedication. Now, let's talk quickly about some background issues about Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Haggai is perhaps the only book of the Old Testament that none of the scholars and critics argue about, basically, because every indicator of its time frame, including the book itself, agrees. There's no reason to argue about it. As far as its content, it's a time of the testing of the faith of the remnant, the folks that have returned to Jerusalem. They're trying to get, Haggai is trying to get the temple going again. He and Zechariah, they're trying to get the people to get up and finish the work. They and the leadership, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, these guys, they're trying to get done what needs to be done. Nothing has been done for 16 years at this point. They've just concentrated on themselves. What happens when all of our energy and our attention is directed to ourselves? Our spirits go begging. We'll starve to death spiritually if we focus only on ourselves and our physical and material desires. Well, that's what they were doing. And so they were not prospering. That's why Haggai talks about putting your wealth in a bag of holes. You're not making any progress. The reason that they're economically and materially impoverished, you're not doing what you ought to be doing. You're not prospering because you're not paying attention to the work that God has given you to do. Now, in chapter 2, the second temple is is not as ostentatious as the first temple. Zerubbabel's temple, like I said, is a poor man's copy of Solomon's temple. But it's the temple that will be the foundation of the temple that Jesus would worship in, would come to. Herod, of course, would greatly enlarge and magnify and beautify it, basically rebuild everything in it 400 years later. Herod would turn it into a beautiful destination, and it would take all of his life and part of the lives of a couple of his sons to finish it. In fact, the temple that Jesus knew was finished in 69 AD, completely finished, just in time to be destroyed, just in time for the conclusion of the Jewish national existence as God's chosen people. That second temple, though, sets the stage for the spiritual temple, which is the church. The glory of this house shall be greater, this latter house shall be greater than the former, not because the building is beautiful or anything, but because of who would ultimately be there. It's ironic. The tent of meeting, the temple of Solomon, all of these things signified what to the Jewish people? They represented God's presence among them. In the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. In Solomon's temple, beautiful, beautiful building, ornate, in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. What's the top section of the Ark of the Covenant described as? This is called the mercy seat. And it represents, in the ancient Jewish mind, this is where God sits. This is God's place. This is the tangible evidence that God dwells among his people. The tabernacle is taken out of the way, replaced by Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple then is looted, plundered, burnt, and demolished because of the unspirituality of the people. And when they do finally get to rebuild a temple, they don't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore. And so they put a placeholder there. And it's in that temple, enlarged, rebuilt, remodeled, etc., by Herod, but nonetheless, that temple, that God, in literal human form, actually steps foot in that place. In the tabernacle, in Solomon's temple, God's presence was spiritual, God's dwelling was metaphorical. In Jesus, it's literal. God in the flesh is actually there. And so the glory of the latter temple is greater than the glory of the former, even though it's a poor man's copy, because God, in the person of Jesus, is literally there. Well, that brings us over to Zechariah. And Zechariah is presented as the grandson of Iddo, the priest who's mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 12, a contemporary of Zerubbabel. He's a young man, probably still a young man when he begins to prophesy. And we don't know much about him other than the visions that are recorded in the book of Zechariah. This is during the time frame, though, that the Greek nation, not yet an empire under Alexander, but the Greek nation is beginning to spread and expand and flex its muscles. And here, the Persians and the Greeks bump into each other. The Persians set about to invade Greece in the 5th century BC during this time frame. And that's the first time that basically they're successfully resisted. And Xerxes comes home to lick his wounds. And that would be during the time frame of Esther, most likely. Notice, though, Matthew 23 and verse 35. Matthew 23 and 35 seems to indicate that Zechariah may have been martyred in the temple by a mob. Take your Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 23. What's the context of this? This is Jesus taking the religious rulership to task. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. But you get down here to verse 29. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have shed the blood. We would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness or testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Now, this is the English Standard Translation, so if it's a little different, that's why. Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. So there we have an inspired record of what happened to this man, even though it's not recorded in the book of Zechariah. Now, Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13 is quoted in Matthew 27, verses 9 and 10 as a prophecy by Jeremiah. But that does not show an error. Rather, it shows a time frame. That is, this whole period is being accounted to the time frame of Jeremiah rather than singled out to Zechariah specifically. Now you have an extensive sidebar outlining Zechariah there. You also have a very handy little map showing Xerxes' campaign into Greece and how he was, where he was defeated. By the way, that's the plains of Marathon, the 300 and so forth. Those are the events that we're talking about here. And Zechariah gives us a lot of secular history of the time frame as well as prophecy of the Messiah. It also anticipates the coming of Alexander the Great and the rise of the power of Greece. Well, that brings us then to Malachi. And Malachi, you have some information in the text here about his name. There is a little textual discrepancy in the Septuagint, but that's not significant really. There is no real question, no real legitimate challenge to the dating of Malachi, only an objection on the part of skeptics to the content of it, because of course it basically takes the form of a trial challenging the people's unbelief and unfaithfulness to God. Okay, our time is concluded. Questions, comments, observations before we call it a class?
Brother?
Yes.
That record about the Herodian person that documented those.
About who? Oh, Herodotus, yes.
Herodotus. It strikes me that was that written later than, or was it written about the time he's talking about, just to make a point.
Hold on just a minute. I've got that book on my desk. Memory serves me. Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus in the Roman province of Asia Minor, what we would call Turkey, around 485 BC. So he would be roughly contemporary with all of these prophets that we've been talking about tonight. He traveled extensively through both Greece and the Persian Empire, and he apparently was just a copious note taker and writer. He was a witness to the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century, about 425 BC. And he saw for himself and recorded the defeat of the Persians in Greece when they first went in to try to conquer Greece. Herodotus was there and recorded that. It was not expected even by the Greeks that they would win, much less by the Persians, but that's where the power of the Persian Empire was broken. And then Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes, generally speaking, we understand these three names to be the same guy, or perhaps father and son, goes home to lick his wounds, basically.
My whole point is that there are some discrepancies in what he records.
Right.
But yet, critics are more prepared to accept him as being valid and authentic. But when the Bible gives its accounts of the same thing that he talks about, they dismiss it and say that it can't be believed, it's doubtful. But yet, they're prepared to accept this person's, it just shows their dishonesty, their intellectual dishonesty.
Right. Why would one get more credit than the other?
Yeah.
Except in their minds, this guy is just a historian. He's not preaching at us, and the Bible is.
Right, yeah.
And that's, even though it's not admitted, that's ultimately what it comes down to in every case. We don't like the preachy part of it. We don't like the prescriptive part of it. So we're going to try to discredit it. And that's where that stands, basically. And the irony of that, secular history demonstrates that Herodotus leaves out a lot of things, as we pointed out, and secular or archaeological findings just keep building the case for the scriptures. It's over decades and over centuries, but every time something is unearthed, it doesn't disprove the Bible.
Yeah.
If it speaks to anything, it proves the Bible. But we can't have a book that tells us how to live.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, other comments? We will, one way or another, we will get caught up. A week behind right now. But Lord willing, next week we'll be looking at the wisdom literature. I'll be sending you some other, the stuff that Dave sent you this evening, the sheets that he sent you are actually just a series of bulletin articles from a long series over the books of the Bible. And I'll be sending you some more of those on Job and Psalms and Proverbs and so forth. Just sort of little synopses of the books as kind of background information.
Thank you.
If there's nothing else, we'll call it class and say good night. Thank you for being here.
Good night.
Good night.